Deep tech is defined as technology that has tangible IP and a scientific layer to it. So probably something analogous is life sciences, biotechnology. But now you are seeing deep tech with that scientific layer, and so a lot of that expertise is only really available at postgraduate levels within universities. And this wasn't something that investors previously tapped into, but now more and more people are seeing the value of deep tech, the rise of deep tech. 45% of new startups are actually in deep tech now. So this was a startup genome report that was released this year, and I was just shocked to see this line of deep tech just rising, but a lot of that expertise and talent is at universities. I don't believe they are born. I genuinely think you can teach these skills, shift the mindset, and then it becomes more experimental and encouraging this culture of experimentation and failure. And I would say from my research, of course there's cultural nuances in that. The Americans are very, very good at that. Europeans, I would say, are more risk averse. But the millennial generation, Gen Z, I think there's much more openness to trying new things, and I think they know they're not going to have a job for the next 20 years. So there's a much more open culture of being able to try new things and experiment. I do think, however, there's a personality trait in there. I think it's that ability to take risk and be comfortable with it, and the comfort with ambiguity and uncertainty. But again, I would say some people might be more predisposed to having that mindset, but the more you experiment, the more you try, and the more you have a culture that allows you to do that, whether at university, at school, in the workplace, the more you will become entrepreneurial. And honestly, you don't have a job for life anymore. You have to be able to adapt and innovate in every context that you see in the working world. So I don't think, even if you don't start a venture from university, you have to be able to develop those traits and skills and the entrepreneurial mindset. I think we're starting to see, from traditional KPIs of, your balance sheet and P&L purely on profits, to now actually measuring impact in different ways. So there's something called the ESG, environmental social goals, which institutional investors are now looking at. There's a whole framework around stakeholder impact measurements. So when you start putting that in and making CEOs responsible also for those metrics and filtering that down through the organization, that's how I think people are starting to change. I think where the middle layer is here is how do we effectively articulate those metrics, then how do we measure them? It's not as black and white as here's my P&L and here's the bottom line. So I think that's where the Jamie Dimons of the world and these 100 CEOs who've signed these letters saying we need to be able to have wider social impact. What does that mean in terms of every single micro process of your business? They are fundamentally turning the design of business on its head. So you're looking at every single part of the business model canvas, your supply chain to customer behavior, and they're saying, how can we influence customer behavior for more positive benefits? How can we look at the supply chain and make sure that gains accrue evenly across that supply chain versus a winner-takes-all mentality? So I think this is really starting from the grassroots. I think corporates who have been running for 50-odd years have a harder time because they've had legacy organizations. But I think the literature, the education, the impetus is there to actually start making these changes and build this into the metrics of the business. So within the context of, I would say, corporate firms, for example, who are looking at what's on the horizon and how do we invest or even understand these, I think you can start with business processes that really require deep learning within them. So they may not initially require scientific layers, but HR, for example, I've seen a lot more around how do you remove biases in the HR process. There's a lot of deep technology companies around this area, and what they can do is quite incredible. But I think being able to understand that companies genuinely have to have a very clear filtering criteria for these types of expertise, and also have experts which they can lean on to better understand these. So I think the links between academia and corporates need to be much deeper if they're to understand what's on the horizon. So over this past 3 months, I've been working with London School of Economics student and alumni and listening to their views on how they're thinking about entering the world of work. And what's really interesting is that they want to work for companies which are purpose-driven. I think if you just have a mandate with profit maximization and you're only thinking about your company and you're not thinking about wider stakeholder impact, that is not a cue to attract talent anymore. So from a company perspective, I think they have to understand that intrinsically people graduating from university want to see that, and they want to hold companies accountable for this. And I think consumers are also demanding that. So I think that's the first thing, is what's the company's mission? Do they have a purpose? The second thing is going back to leadership, people don't want command and control. There's been multiple studies done and of why there is job dissatisfaction, and one of it is autonomy and the ability to have some creativity in your work. So you have to be able to build that into HR structures and incentives and allow people that time to explore that creativity in a way that's also viable for the business. But increasingly people want autonomy. And I would say, you know, the third thing around that is the portfolio career. People will not be wedded to one company for the rest of their life. Increasingly you'll have a job, but you'll also have a side hustle. A side hustle is developing, you know, some kind of business on the side. It may be something to do with a hobby you've had, a personal interest, or an opportunity you see, but they should be able to coexist with your job. And actually that's a virtuous circle. So if you're developing those skills on the side, it can be extremely useful for your job as well. And you know, one thing we've talked about a lot at the LSE is developing an entrepreneurial mindset. So if you have graduates that go into the corporate world, you still got to create buy-in, launch new ideas, launch new products. The lifespan of a company used to be 50 years, it's now down to 15. So if you're not innovating and you're not disruptive and you don't know how to launch new ideas and products, I think you're going to be quickly outdated. So that, I think, the portfolio career actually lends itself to companies being able to survive and innovate faster. We are seeing more responsible technology and tech for good, for example. So this is, you know, there's courses at UCL around tech for good. So technology is here to stay, absolutely, but the infrastructure around technology and using technology for good versus for evil, if I can say that word, that is changing. And I think the capital is starting to recognise you can't have companies which are gender imbalanced, which are not inclusive from an internal perspective, which are not paying for negative externalities. That layer of learning is becoming much quicker with much less data. The good impact I've seen on this is much more around the life sciences in terms of what I've studied, and around precision medicine, which I talked about before. So being very accurate in terms of diagnosis, in terms of gleaning just small levels of data and being able to understand healthcare much more robustly than you would previously.